Over the last the 200 years, or the two centuries that the Mass Medical Society has been in operation, there are a number of scourges that physicians have successfully been able to protect our clients from. There, however, remains one scourge that yet is alive and well, and one that we have not able to get a hold on yet, and that is gender-based violence, especially in armed conflicts. Ban Ki-moon, who is the UN Secretary General, in 2007 made this statement. He said, "In no other area is our collective failure to ensure effective protection for civilians more apparent than in terms of the masses of women and girls and men and boys whose lives are destroyed each year by sexual violence perpetrated in conflict." And in that point, I just came to establish the fact that we as physicians in particular have a unique opportunity to come together and to really take a lead in supporting the multiple interventions that are required to address this issue. In 1979, the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, often referred to as CEDAW, established this definition of gender-based violence, noting, of course, that it is different from other types of violence and that the aggressor in particular attacks the victim or the victims specifically because of their gender. And it includes any act which results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm. What is particularly unique about this definition is that it also acknowledges that even coercion or the threat of force is sufficient to be considered a gender-based violence. So these women are different, but they're similar in the fact that they've both been victims. What's particularly interesting about this picture is that you will observe that it includes boys. And my point is even though much of the conversation about gender-based violence is a reference to women, because indeed women are the largest and the largest category of victims, it yet remains that boys and men are also victims of gender-based violence, and we've been seeing that more and more in contemporary conflicts. So once again, this is a young boy that I met in Darfur in Western Sudan, but this young man is one of the few men that has actually disclosed to me that he was a victim of rape while he was enslaved in Northern Sudan. And what the people in the community tell us is that of all of the people who are reintegrated into their communities once they come back to South Sudan, it is these men and boys who have the greatest difficulty reintegrating. What then are the motives for gender-based violence, especially in the context of gender-based violence as a weapon of war? You'll look through these, and what you can understand is that it's designed to not simply eliminate someone or to wound somebody. It's designed to undermine the community for generations to come. And in that sense, one of the reasons that we are hearing so much more about this kind of violence is, and in many ways, it's far more efficient than an AK-47, because it's cheaper. And not only do you instill damage on the particular victim, terrorize the victim for the moment, but as I suggested, it takes out generations to come. So it undermines the community and the integrity of the community, not just then, but forever. What are the physical consequences? These certainly there are the physical consequences of violence that are just sort of the generic consequences of violence, with broken bones, concussions, wounds, amputations, and even up to death. But in particular for women, there are the extreme gynecological emergencies. Sometimes if women are infected with HIV, you're already, these kinds of consequences are being introduced into contexts where at best there is strained resources, and at worst there are indeed no resources. Oftentimes women who are pregnant at the time, and again these are individuals who are especially targeted, can be subject to losing their baby or to developing other complications, chronic PID, infertility, so that again we're talking about consequences that are long lasting. And then, of course, there are the immediate psychological consequences, but there are also the longer-term psychological consequences. I'm going to take you now into South Sudan, and this is the scene that I saw in July of 2001 when I made my first trip into Sudan. I went under the auspices of a group in Zurich called Christian Solidarity International that invited me and my husband and another good friend, broadcast journalist Liz Walker, to see the impact of slavery. What would happen, the scenario that people would describe, is one that, again, if you've been following Darfur, there's one that is familiar in which people will say that they will certainly hear the sound of the Antonov planes coming. They'll hear the bombs drop, and then men on horseback will come. Typically, they will kill men immediately, which is why so many people sent their young boys away from their villages, and why so many of us don't know about the lost boys of Sudan. They are here, they're alive because their parents sent them away. But then they will typically rape the women and certainly loot the materials, and in some cases they will take the hostages into the north where they are then sold into slavery. Over the years, local communities developed a very elaborate underground railroad in which they would partner with individuals who would go into the north, identify people from their village, retrieve them and return them to their villages, and all of this was done in exchange for money, and eventually it was at $33 per person. So for a simple $33 per person at that time, you too could have purchased the freedom of a slave. So this was a scene that I saw when I made my first trip into Sudan. This was a large crowd of several hundred people who were being returned through this underground railroad. And you can imagine having, as I listened and learned to their stories, I had the distinct impression that having left the land of the free on July 4th, I had certainly arrived in the home of the brave. This woman, again, was one of the first women that I met, and one of the significant reasons why I'm involved in this work now. You will, of course, note the scarring that is on her chest. These were scars from injuries that she sustained during an attempt to resist the rape when she was initially captured in her village. This child who is off to her side is her own child. This child is one that she's adopted because this child's mother died in the context of being raped. So again, this is a kind of abuse that is just simply par for the course, that many of us have no way of wrapping our minds around, but this is what people endure on an ongoing basis. And for me, it really raised the question of who will be my sister's keeper. I will say certainly as a woman of African American descent, as a woman who is a descendant of African slaves, I especially felt a call, a responsibility to do something, to intervene in a way that had not been done for my ancestors some 400 years earlier. And so, as you've heard, I've practiced my pediatrics for some 27 years. It was 3 years ago that I actually stopped practicing, and now am engaged in this work on a full-time basis, and I will be my sister's keeper. And indeed, what's a physician to do? I want to suggest a few things that as physicians we can do. First of all, everybody needs to find your own Sudan. And by that I mean to find a place that is not necessarily comfortable, that is not necessarily familiar, that is not easy, that is not simply something that can be addressed with a check, but something that really takes your emotions out of you and allows you to go deeper and discover your own strength. Claude Bissell, who is an educator from the University of Toronto, I love what he says, and this is what I think of when I think about Sudan. A place where you risk more than others think is safe, care more than others think is wise, dream more than others think is practical, and expect more than others think is possible. For me, my Sudan was the place where I came to a certain reality about who I am as a physician. And I had learned early on that we can simply see ourselves as pursuing a career in medicine, and you know what that's like when you pursue a career in medicine, or we answer a call to a ministry of healing. And so while I have left medicine in a formal sense, I very much see myself very still engaged in medicine, especially when I think about it in the context of a ministry of healing. It's also important to educate yourself and to educate others. And I draw your attention, especially, this is a booklet that's going to be on the table for your information. This is Physicians for Human Rights. This is a group that is based here in Cambridge that I think is doing some of the most amazing work with regard not only to gender-based violence, but to human rights abuses around the world. Torture is another area that they've done a lot of work on, and the landmines, they're one of the ones who've shared in the Nobel Peace Prize and from the 1997 to ban landmines. There's another group that I draw your attention to, the Consortium on Gender Security and Human Rights. This is based at UMass Boston. Also want to encourage you to support survivors in your practice. It's often the case that many of us don't necessarily have the time to even ask the question, but if you have individuals in your practice who you know come from conflict zones, and there are growing numbers of what we call conflict refugees in our midst, simply pause and ask them the question. I know that you are from X region, and I know that many people have experienced a lot of trauma as a result of that, and simply open it up, and you may readily discover that your patient that you've been seeing over and over again for years and years is also a victim of gender-based violence. So just simply ask the question, what then do you do? And this is what you do not only on a local level, but also on a national and an international level. And it's for any kind of violence, so for domestic violence as well as victims of gender-based violence in the context of conflict. First of all, document what you see. Again, this is something that's very basic that we know about as physicians. Take the time to document the injuries and the extent of the injuries. Provide health care. Make sure that the emotional support and referrals and case management are in place. Legal advice. And it's important that we understand that we hold people accountable for the injustice, prosecute the offenders, advocate for the human rights, and then promote training and income opportunities. And this is especially the case in conflict zones, where so often women who are victims, because they don't have any other alternatives, and so they open themselves up to being violated in order to sometimes get money and to meet their needs. But it's also important to provide advocacy on the local, the national, and the global level. And so to advocate for specific policy legislation, to sensitize the people who are often called on to address the crisis, to ensure that there are legal supports available. And again, this is something that physicians can uniquely do. Ensure that the forensic evidence is collected and that it's adequate and it's preserved, so that at the appropriate time we can summon it forth. And then what can you do? I would encourage you, first of all, to get educated yourself, and to educate yourself and to educate others about the urgency of the crisis in Sudan. To participate in any number of campaigns to secure peace and justice in Sudan. These are some of the organizations that have been particularly tenacious on the issue of Sudan. And one of the things that if we had time, I would encourage you to do is to call this number 1-800-GENOCIDE. And sometimes it's fun to just have people take out their cell phones and make the call. Sometimes what you'll do is they'll ask you to plug in your zip code, and they will actually connect you to your congressperson's office and give you the script so that you can say, this is what I'm concerned about. Right now, if you call this number, you'll get connected to Hillary Clinton's office, because what we're advocating for is that the U.S. government appoint a special envoy focused on the crisis in Sudan and Darfur, so that we continue to move forward with the efforts to promote peace. A good part of my work is spent collaborating with Sudanese women who are working for peace. And certainly this is, I'm not shameless in making this request too. You can also donate to our organization, My Sister's Keeper, which is misskeeper.org. I conclude with this statement. This is one that was made by President John F. Kennedy, and in which he refers to the great French Marshal Lyoté, who once asked his gardener to plant a tree. The gardener objected that the tree was slow growing and would not reach maturity for 100 years. And then Marshall replied, well, in that case, there's no time to lose. Plant it this afternoon. So once again, gender-based violence in the context of conflict is one that we have known throughout the ages. It's one that is like so many of our problems, seems so pernicious, so persistent. And the effort to really address it seems like it could easily become overwhelming. One could easily get weary in well-doing. And yet, we don't have any time to waste. We have lives at stake. We have communities at stake. We have the integrity of a nation and the integrity of a world at stake. Let's get busy. Thank you so much.